Just over a year after the oppressive, staunchly communist regime of Leonid Brezhnev ended, a man came to power as General Secretary of the Soviet Communist Party. This man would bring about political, economic, and social reform unlike anything previously experienced in the Soviet Union. His name, Mikhail Gorbachev. Step 1 of Gorbachev's plan was to improve the economy. This process was called perestroika. More private enterprise was allowed, this being known as Gazpromka, in order to improve the quality of machinery, unlike that in this image. Gorbachev also planned to do away with conservative communist officials and replace them with more liberal democratic ones, so out went Alexander Gromyko. And in his place, enter Edward Shevardnadze. Shevardnadze was particularly experienced in agriculture. One of Gorbachev's first proposed economic reforms was the prohibition of alcohol. It backfired, hurting industry and costing the government great sums of money. This would be a recurring theme throughout Gorbachev's reign. Gorbachev would continue the ongoing process of de-Stalinization. Next in line was reforming the economic structure of the Union to be more of a market economy and less controlled by the government. All of this would be introduced at the 27th Congress of the Communist Party in early 1986. In early 1987, Gorbachev proposed something unheard of, allowing elections that would feature multiple candidates from multiple parties. For the first time, the dream of democracy and not authoritarianism was a realistic opportunity for the Soviet people. Following this idea, Gorbachev would publicly denounce Joseph Stalin and released Lenin's Testament from the 1920s to the public. This book was essentially Lenin informing people why Stalin was dangerous and should not be allowed to come to power. Gorbachev's idea of glasnost, or openness, was truly becoming a reality. In May of 1988, Gorbachev's biggest economic reform was enacted, the law of cooperatives. Private enterprise and businesses were allowed. Such a policy had not existed in the USSR since Vladimir Lenin's NEP. To this point, the Soviet government had monopolized the economy in every industry, but no longer would this be the case. In 1990, the CPSU Communist Party's monopoly of the political sphere was revoked with the repeal of Article 6 of the Soviet Constitution. The position of president, which would have an actual election determined by the people, would come to be. In March of 1989, elections for legislative branches were held. When this was decided, Gorbachev was elected by this representative body, but he had run unopposed. We must question why this was, in what was essentially now a republican system. Despite Gorbachev's unopposed victory as executive president of the USSR, he did indeed have a political opponent on the horizon. This man, the executive of the Russian Republic, was none other than the legendary Boris Yeltsin. Gorbachev's domestic reforms of perestroika and glasnost were, at times, unsuccessful. His international diplomacy, however, met critical acclaim from the West. One of his most hailed reforms was the nuclear arsenal cut of 1985. Another, the end of the Soviet-Afghan War. And perhaps most importantly, the end of the Brezhnev Doctrine. No longer would the Soviets throw themselves after Eastern European countries in attempts to maintain their communism and protect against the forces of Western democracy. The end of the Brezhnev Doctrine would mark the beginning of the end for the Soviet Union. In 1989, knowing that Gorbachev would not try to use violence against them, minority republics, which had been autonomous prior to Soviet expansion, revolted one by one. All revolts, save for one, had been peaceful. By refusing to use the Red Army against the revolutionaries, Gorbachev did what Mao Zedong's Chinese regime had failed to do: protect human lives. For this he was rewarded the 1990 Nobel Peace Prize. The sole violent revolution had occurred in Romania and would soon be over. Like in Eastern Europe, the East Germans and East Berliners demanded the ability to move between East and West Germany, or Berlin, respectively. In November of 1989, the Berlin Wall was destroyed. East Germans could now travel freely to the non-Soviet West Berlin. Despite Gorbachev's highly acclaimed diplomacy, his domestic economic plan was failing. Food shortages were persistent, and Gorbachev's own plan to transfer to a more liberal economy was decimating him as a politician. Even more weakening of the state would come. Full-blown nationalist revolutions would again break out in 1990. The four main sites of these: Azerbaijan, Moldova, Lithuania, and Armenia. However, shortly thereafter, the Supreme Soviet would grant Gorbachev increased power in the wake of economic stagnation and a depleting empire. For all his reforms in democracy, Gorbachev began to move back towards conservative communism. It was with good intentions, but would lead directly to the downfall of Gorbachev himself. Finally, the end had come. In August 1991, the conservative communists that Gorbachev had fallen back on would attempt to upend him in a coup d'etat. For 2 days, insurrection was rampant, but the staunch communist rule was not to be, for it was extremely unpopular. A strong coalition of forces moved against it, causing its ultimate failure. The leader of this democratic opposition? Indeed, the man, the myth, the legend, Boris Yeltsin.